Welcome, everyone, to lecture number 18 on 20th century Latin America. Now, the story of this region is one of sometimes things change and sometimes things stay the same simultaneously. We've got a number of holdovers from the Spanish colonial era in this region of the world. Many issues that were never resolved after these nations rose up in rebellion just keep lingering into the 20th century. For instance, we've already talked about the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and how a lot of that was fueled by lingering social and economic inequality, the poor working conditions of those from the lower classes, uneven industrialization, high illiteracy rates, foreign interference. We talked about, for example, how many U.S. business interests had established themselves in Latin America over time and were interested in protecting their interests, sometimes at the expense of the native populations there. Some things will change, however. The Roman Catholic Church, by the late 19th century, still a huge force in many of these societies, they now had become very much about public outreach. They had established a number of schools in many of these countries, and what becomes known as liberation theology becomes very popular among the Catholic clergy in these countries. So what was liberation theology? Well, by the 1950s and 60s, Marxist social theory was kind of being blended in with Catholic humanitarianism. The church had already been tending to the needs of the poor, identifying injustices, for example, towards the working class at the hands of corrupt businessmen and leaders. And so we will see that for some members of the Roman Catholic clergy, they are going to preach that it was time for these people to be liberated from all of the repression they had had to endure, hence the term liberation theology. Unfortunately, there were very powerful political and military and economic interests that did not want this liberation theology idea to spread any further. They liked things the way they were with these dramatic inequalities. As a result, hundreds of nuns, priests, and Catholic officials who dared to speak out against the exploitation of the poor were often cruelly killed. For example, in March of 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador was shot dead during Mass because he condemned the military killings taking place at the hands of the government of that country. We will also see that another factor, another aggravating factor, I'll say, for many of these Latin American countries is the ongoing intrusive presence of outside powers meddling in their business. So foreign influences are a destabilizing force. For instance, there were a number of European-owned coffee plantations in Brazil. There were British shipping firms that controlled a lot of traffic to and from the continent. The United States had copper mining interests in Chile. Especially irksome was the increasingly interventionist United States. Between 1901 and 1928 alone, for example, the United States intervened militarily in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America more than 50 times in just a 27-year period. And as you can see from the map here, that it doesn't stop in 1928. The United States continues to draw upon the Monroe Doctrine. And in fact, we will see under President Theodore Roosevelt the development of what becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This is the United States claiming the right to intervene in the domestic affairs of Latin American nations, to keep order, to make sure debts were paid, and to administer justice. By the way, as you can probably guess, the United States, when it made this declaration to essentially be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, the United States did not ask these countries if they wanted this. None of these countries were a big fan of it. As a result, they felt like it was just the United States bullying them to protect their own economic and political ambitions. And essentially what this policy did was create a deep hatred of the United States in many sectors of Latin America. This became known as Yankee imperialism. It also resulted in a number of strongman military dictatorships set up throughout the region. whereby the people no longer got to choose their leaders. Instead, the United States would work behind the scenes in these countries to simply install yes men in positions of power, those that would agree to the United States coming in and making more money. And in many cases, these dictators, because they were not accountable, they weren't voted into office by the people themselves, they could care less about the welfare of the people they were supposed to be governing. So you can see how this is sowing the seeds of a lot of anti-Americanism in Latin America during this period. The country of Cuba is a good example of a country that became intertwined with American foreign policy after the Spanish-American War. Basically, the United States had been overseeing the Cuban economy and their political situation. Cuba was highly reliant on sugar exports to and manufactured imports from the United States. So basically, the United States had come to essentially take almost total control of the Cuban economy. This caused a tremendous amount of resentment, though, over time. The Cuban people said, we don't exist as a satellite state of the United States. We're our own independent country. We should take control of our own economic and political destiny. Also, this situation yielded a growing disparity between the urban middle classes and the rural poor, many of whom felt trapped as agricultural laborers on huge plantations where 80% of sugar farms were owned by U.S. companies, and they often paid poor wages. So you have a lot of anti-imperialist sentiment, people saying, the Americans need to go home, let us handle our own business. It didn't help that the American strongman, Fulgencio Batista, basically had alienated himself from the Cuban population he was supposed to be governing and protecting. In the 1950s, reform-minded opposition mounted, most notably among leftist university-educated individuals such as Fidel Castro. Castro gained support, especially among the disfranchised poor who were tired of American meddling on their island. He will attempt several armed insurrections, and in 1959, the Cuban Revolution will take place. He will install himself as prime minister of the island at that point. Unfortunately, there was bloodshed attached to the Cuban Revolution. Thousands who resisted Castro's takeover were killed, others herded into slave labor camps. In some cases, Cuban refugees took to boats to try and come to the mainland of the United States. That's why we have a number of flourishing Cuban American communities in the state of Florida today. From the standpoint of the United States, this is unacceptable. They will launch a series of assassination attempts to unseat Castro. A failed invasion in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, will reveal the lengths to which the United States will go to try to reassert their authority on the island of Cuba. However, Cuba's victory became a shared victory throughout Latin America. Many people were watching intensively what was happening in 1959, and they thought, well, wow, if the Cubans can do this, maybe we can do this in our country as well. In Chile, for example, Marxist Salvador Allende became president of that country in 1970. Unfortunately, not by democratic election, but through violent revolution. Allende understood that the people of Chile were enduring a grim existence. Infant mortality was high in the country, health conditions were poor, services were inadequate, malnutrition was common, and that the people of Chile wanted to take control of their own country, away from foreign domination. He will help to establish the so-called popular unity government based upon socialist principles. He will take over U.S.-owned copper companies in that country without compensating the United States, something that set him seriously at odds with the U.S. government. His government also began taking over large agricultural estates to distribute land to peasant cooperatives. He attempted to redistribute incomes and authorize large wage increases and froze prices. Unfortunately, all of this change in such a short amount of time caused some serious financial upheaval in Chile. Yet Allende retained the support of many workers and peasants. He won the vote in March of 1973. But at this point, the government of the United States, through the CIA, were infiltrating the country and attempting to stage a military coup, which would ultimately be successful. Allende's ties to Fidel Castro and his socialist leanings were simply unacceptable to the United States. And Allende will be killed in the progress of this coup, this change of power, where the U.S. State Department will reassert their control in the country of Chile and appoint a yes man by the name of Pinochet, who ended up, as you might expect, later on turning on his own people and massacring them in very large numbers. So Chile is a kind of a sad example of foreign interference and how it is ultimately the people of these countries that will suffer the most. And finally, we turn to Argentina under Juan Perón. Perón was an army colonel who became president of Argentina multiple times. He was very well liked, at least to begin with, from 1946 to 1952, from 52 to 55, and from 73 to 74. His visit to Italy in 1938 resulted in him becoming a strong admirer of Benito Mussolini's style and rhetoric. After returning home in 1941, he joined a secret group of military officers who in 1943 staged a coup to overthrow the civilian government there. And so, preaching industrialization as well as government intervention, Perón came to promote a so-called third way that was neither capitalism nor communism, but kind of a blend between those two governmental styles. He constructed many public works such as schools and hospitals. He was quite popular with the working class. In particular, the descamisados, or the shirtless ones, really ended up becoming the backbone of Perón's most faithful group in Argentina during the period. He was also helped enormously by his very popular wife, Eva, who started important social programs for the poorest Argentinians. She promoted women's suffrage, personally handed out cash in the streets to the needy, and the Perón government helped to nationalize the railroads and utilities and constructed numerous public works projects. The darker side to his rule: he also severely restricted existing constitutional liberties for his people and rewrote the law simply in 1949 to allow him to be elected again. He will also run afoul of the Roman Catholic Church after attempting to legalize prostitution and divorce. The economy began to stagnate. The working class began to lose faith in Perón over time. He then started calling for all traitors to be found and jailed. His fall from power was rapid. He'll end up spending some 18 years in exile, mostly in Spain and Venezuela. He will ultimately return in 1973 and be reelected against almost all odds for a one-year term as president. But when he died in 1974, terrorist activity, political violence began breaking out across the country, and in 1976, the armed forces of Argentina took power. Fortunately, in the coming decades, we will see some gradual democratic reforms in Argentina.